To those of you in the working world, I suppose I should say, congratulations on making it to Friday. For me, every day is Friday, but I appreciate all the effort you put in this week to make it to this point. So, pull up a seat by the fire, and let's all enjoy some cozy tales here on Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. Let's get you all settled in and have some more great times with more amazing stories. Today, we are reading about old gods and the things they leave behind sometimes. So, I hope you're not squeamish when it comes to cosmic horror. Let's start off with a story about an artifact deep in the woods that a trio of boys set out to find. Let's hear a story about the woodland seat. Everyone had heard of the throne, but very few people had ever seen it. The woodland seat was something of a local legend. If you follow the river into the woods, turn east at the huge rubber tree at the fork, and walk into the setting sun, you'll come to the Devil's Clearing. In the clearing, a place where nothing is said to grow, sits a chair of stone. If you sit on the chair, you'll be cursed by the devil himself for all time. It's a story I've heard since I was old enough to go to sleepovers, and it's a story I've always wanted to prove or disprove. People have gone into the woods, and I remember the first time someone showed me shaky cam footage from a camcorder of a weird stone chair with faces carved into it. It was later proven to be a fake. The chair was something they'd made themselves and shot at night, but other people claimed to have gone into the woods and found it, their videos proving either better or worse than that first bit of wobbly cinematography that I watched on a couch at my friend John's house. But they all fed the fire of my enthusiasm. It's always been my dream to see it. The real seat. And when Mrs. Raggles assigned us a final project about urban legends for senior English class, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. The assignment was actually about the cause of urban legends, and she wanted us to make our own. When I asked if we could make our project a search for the woodland seat, she looked almost tickled. This wouldn't have anything to do with John's senior project for AV, would it, she asked, giving me a little wink. It might, I hedged, as good as telling her our intentions. John and I have been friends for years, and his interest in movies, especially making them, has been ongoing since the two of us were in elementary school. John got his first camera when he was 6, some cheap thing that his dad had picked up from Toys R Us after John practically begged him for it. I'd say John definitely got his money's worth, because we spent the next 4 years making our own short films and epic movies in the backyard. Through the years, John's cameras may have changed, but his interest in filmmaking hasn't. He often calls on me and our friends, Sean and Fred, to star in his latest project, and this would be no exception. I got enough battery packs and memory cards to reward for 3 straight days, he told us as we sat in his garage and suffered through his pitch meeting. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be able to shoot the next found footage masterpiece. John's project, his senior film thesis, was about urban legends too, specifically their place in horror films. He wanted to make the woodland seat the antagonist in his new found footage movie, the witch in his Blair Witch Project, in other words, and use us as his bumbling teen cast that goes looking for it. I was looking forward to using this trip to write my own paper for Mrs. Raggles, but Sean and Fred were just looking for an excuse to go camping for a few days in the lush woods that surround our town. We'd all grown up in the area, and the woods weren't unknown to us. We all enjoyed camping, right up until the first winter chill sent us back inside every year. And I, too, was looking forward to spending some time in the woods, cooking hot dogs and s'mores as we told stories and just hung out this weekend. So when we told our parents we'd see them Monday night and headed into the woods Friday afternoon, we were prepared to spend the next 3 days in nature. We had plenty of food, plenty of water, and we were properly prepared with a 4-man tent and sleeping bags. It was April, and the weather was already becoming unseasonably warm, so we didn't think we needed anything too strenuous. John was carrying his film equipment, his camera already out, and the 3 of us were carrying the stuff we would need for camping and survival, acting as his trusty pack mules. As we came to the river, the surface frothing with the late-season snowmelt from the nearby mountains, John told me this would make a great place to film the intro. The river is, after all, the first leg of the journey. From here, we set out to find the woodland seat and write our names for all to see across history. I'll never forget the grin that spread across his face at that moment. It was a golden moment, but nothing golden is made to last. He counted me down as I stood beside the river, preparing to give my lead-in statement. Fred and Sean had unanimously decided that I would do most of the speaking lines for this little movie. Neither of them really wanted to learn any of the lines that John wanted read, and I had the most video-worthy narration voice, they said. I think they just wanted to goof off on our camping trip, but, to be fair, so did I. This is the Leftree River, the start of our journey. I wasn't sure I could even be heard over the rushing rapids, but John gave me a thumbs up, and I struggled on. Legend says that if you follow the river until you come to a huge old rubber tree, you turn east and walk into the woods until dusk, you'll come to the Devil's Clearing and find the woodland seat. Those who sit on it are cursed, tormented for all eternity for daring to sit where the devil himself once took rest. Tonight, we intend to find that seat. And cut, John said, hitting the stop button as he nodded slowly. Very nice. Love it. So what happens if we don't find this rubber tree? Sean asked as we shouldered our packs and headed deeper into the woods. I guess we just wait till we find the fork in the river, I said, after thinking about it for a few seconds. What if we don't find that? Fred asked, taking a sip from his water as the leaves smushed wetly beneath our feet. Boys, you're missing the point, John said. Which is, Fred asked, the point isn't to find the woodland seat or not. We're here to follow the instructions and see if we find anything or not. That's the project. The legend is what brought us here, the power of the urban legend itself. And now we seek to learn where it can take us. Fred laughed. So this could all be a wild goose chase is what you're telling us. I snorted and bumped him with my shoulder. You're getting a 3-day vacation out of it, Fred. Buck up. We followed the river as the afternoon rattled on. The woods were nice this time of year. Summer was on the cusp of arrival, and everything was green. The water would be too cold for swimming, though I suppose Sean might try. Sean liked the cold. He was built for it, and he would probably take a swim tomorrow before we set off. None of us figured we would make it to the Devil's Clearing by sunset today. We'd set up camp, cook some dogs, do some fishing, and tomorrow we'd proceed on. We were camping, after all, so what was the point of hurrying? We walked most of the first day. We weren't going very fast. We'd been at school all day, and we weren't in any real hurry anyway. Monday was a holiday to boot, and our parents knew where we were and wouldn't expect us home till Monday night. We talked and joked, the usual high school boy banter filling our afternoon. But as the sun began to set, we started looking for this tree or this fork. We had been assured that this was the way to go by some kids who had totally been to the Devil's Clearing, and that too was part of the project. If we couldn't find our way by the urban legend alone, then what was the point? It was starting to get dark when we came to the rubber tree. It had to be the one from the stories. For one, it was huge. It was far larger than any normal tree I'd ever seen, and the leaves left very little mystery about its type. It was also smack in the cleft of the river, the water diverting east and west from there, and it seemed like a good place as any to set up our tent. Sean started assembly as Fred and I went to collect firewood. We left John to set up our fire pit and returned with wood to find the pit dug and the tent already erected. As proper dark fell around us, we filled the woods with the smell of roasting weenies, canned chili, and s'mores. "So how do you reckon the chair curses you?" Fred asked, blowing the fire off his blackened hot dog before laying it across a piece of white bread. "Dunno," John said, around a mouthful of meat, and I just shrugged. "I thought you were the expert here," Sean said to me, as he closed his s'more into the metal sphere he used to toast the whole edifice. "I mean, I know the chair is supposed to sit in the clearing, but I don't actually know anything about what it does. There are no stories about how it curses you, so I guess no one's ever been stupid enough to try to sit in it." "Or," John said after swallowing his bite, "it's so bad that it stops anyone from talking about it." We discussed it a little more as the night went on, but as the food was packed away and the fire was doused, we all retired to our sleeping bags for some much-needed rest. I think all of us thought about the seat a little as we drifted off, but it was hard to focus on much after such a long day of hiking. The next day was spent swimming in the river, fishing, going over what we would do that night. John explained how we would come on the clearing at dusk, the sun making a great backdrop for the film. Sean would sit in the chair, pretend to get possessed or something, while the rest of us ran into the woods. There'd be lots of heavy breathing and shaky cam, and then we would begin recording once we had got back to camp. We'll explain how Sean went missing, and then we'll stage some weird noises or something as we record inside the tent. "What happens if we find the chair before dusk?" Fred asked. "Then we stop or make circles till the time is right." "What happens if we don't find the place at all?" Fred asked. John shrugged. "We shoot a piece saying that our search was fruitless and that the legend remains just that." So, as the sun began to sink behind the trees, we set off towards it. From the start, today's hike seemed different. The walk yesterday had been filled with talk and jokes, but today the wood seemed to scowl at the noise we were bringing into its depths. I didn't know right away if the others noticed, but I started to believe that they felt it too. Sean had tried to initiate jokes more than once, but ended up looking around guiltily when the laughter became too loud. Fred was the same way, shushing us more than once before looking around as if to ask why he had done that. John was oblivious, of course, his camera taking it all in as we plotted. If anything, he probably thought we were playing into his vision and was glad for the implied tension. I found myself watching the sun as it rode lower and lower in the sky, not sure if I was dreading being in these suddenly silent woods or finding the thing I'd always wanted to see. The closer we got, the more sure I was that we would find it, and that scared me. I could believe that the devil had come to this place, could believe that he had walked this very path, and I found myself looking down as if I were looking to see hoof prints. No bird song graced this place, none of the usual sounds from insects as they anticipated nightfall, and the silence was unnatural. The woods were lush, the trees thick, but the whole place felt wrong. I didn't have a word for it at the time, but I do now. The word I was looking for was blighted. When do we get to this thing?" Sean asked as he wiped his forehead. He turned to look at me, but I just shrugged. It said we walk towards the sunset, and then you find it. "Well, it better hurry up," Sean said. "We're losing the light, and we'll be setting up camp in the dark in another hour." The sun was getting low beyond the trees, and I realized he was right. The story had never actually said how far you had to walk, just that you had to follow the setting sun. Who knew how far one would actually have to go, or how long you'd have to slog before you got to the seat? We walked for another 20 minutes or so before we began to see something ahead, something that thinned the trees as we walked. The shadows were gathering as we approached the clearing, and it seemed that they gathered around the large and intimidating chair. "Holy shit," John breathed. "It is real." Boy, was it ever. The chair was roughly 5 feet tall and as wide as a lazy boy recliner. It looked to be made of concrete, set with carvings of gems that were painted on by a deft hand. Across the back of the chair, right where a person's back and head would sit, were 3 gray faces with red eyes and open mouths. They all looked identical, but the more I looked, the more I realized how different they all were. One appeared to be crying, another laughing, the middle one simply scowling. The whole construct looked like it would be at home in a mini-golf course or a weird maze attraction, or even a temple found randomly in the middle of the woods. It looked as out of place in the clearing as a dining room set, and as much as I wanted to see it, I couldn't bring myself to get too close to it. It was wrong. Its very essence was foul, and I couldn't comprehend why I'd ever wanted to find this thing in the first place. As John recorded the thing, he pulled his eye away long enough to wave his hand and try to get Sean's attention. He wanted him to go sit in the chair, as they had discussed, and the fact that he was still standing there frustrated John. Sean, for his part, seemed willing enough to comply, but was unable. He was frozen in place, staring at the chair as if he had never seen a chair before in his life, and John pointed at him and then back at me as he tried to get him to go. Sean shuddered as I shook him, looking at me almost dreamily as I got his attention. "Go sit in the chair," I whispered, and Sean nodded slowly as he approached it. He was stopped, however, when Fred pushed him out of the way and made to plant himself on the seat. "What the hell is he doing?" John whispered. I didn't know how to answer him. The two struggled with each other, and the fight would have looked theatrical if I didn't know they weren't acting. Both of them had this blank look, the kind of look you got when you're listening to someone on the phone while you do something else. Fred won their little scuffle, shoving Sean back hard enough to make him fall on his butt, and claimed his prize. He took his seat on the throne, a look of deep satisfaction stretching across his face that slowly became something more exalted. Sean just sat there, looking at him with ambivalence, and as John stepped towards him, something happened. As he sat there, basking in the glow of his newly won seat, Fred's skin began to blister. At first it was just general reddening that I nearly missed in the diminishing light. It was something I could have set aside as just sunburn until the blisters began to appear. His arms and face broke out, the pus-filled sores growing and bursting in fast motion. The blood and pus ran down his arms and the seat of the chair, and as the sun set, his skin began to boil off his bones. He looked like the guy from Raiders of the Lost Ark as his bones began to show through his skin, and as he basked in whatever glow he was experiencing. As he liquefied in the woodland seat, I saw Sean get up and shove Fred's distinctly drippy skeleton out of the chair so that he could take its place. I tried to stop him. I called his name as I came towards him, but he showed no hesitation in the face of Fred's sacrifice. I looked back at John, expecting abject horror, but he had taken the camera away from his eye, and I could see him crying as he watched Sean begin to redden. Not crying in terror or anguish. That would have been easily explained. John was crying in exultation, like a priest who's seen the face of God. John, we have to go now," I said, shaking him. He didn't seem to hear me. He had eyes only for the quickly blistering Sean. John, I yelled, shaking his arm. "We got to get away from here. We need to tell someone what happened. We need to get Sean out of that thing. We need to..." But when I turned back, it was already too late. Sean's skin was melting off his bones, the white already visible, and as his eyes liquefied in his sockets, I tried to pull John away. "John, please," I begged. "Please, we don't have to do this. Don't." But he was already walking towards the chair. As it finished with Sean, he shoved the skeleton out of the seat and sat down amongst the goo and the rot that lay there. That was when I noticed something else. Something I hadn't until Sean's skeleton hit the earth. Fred's bones had disintegrated into powder. A powder that was already being taken away by the forest breeze. I started to run, but something caught my eye before I could get out of the clearing. I saw the camera, the little handheld that John brought into the woods, and I scooped it up before beating a hasty retreat. I fled like a coward, leaving my best friends behind, and I prayed I would never see that cursed chair again. I stumbled through the woods for 3 days, eating whatever I found and drinking from the stream when I finally got back to it. I wished many times that I had picked up one of the bags on my way back out of the clearing, a tent or some food at least, but all I had was the camera and the clothes on my back. I thought about the tent many times as I lay shivering on the damp forest floor, watching the trees for anything, the shadow of the chair, maybe the walking corpses of my friends. I wasn't sure which I was more afraid of seeing, but I just knew that both would be after me before I could escape. When the search party found me on Tuesday, I was afraid my fears had come to pass. They took me to the hospital, but when the police tried to question me, I just handed them the camera and trembled in the face of their questions. That was years ago, nearly a decade, but it's something I never forgot. I haven't seen the footage I gave the police. I have no desire to. The officer who reviewed it said it was the most disturbing thing he'd ever seen, but it did exonerate me of the crime. I think they might have been planning to look further for the bodies of my friends, but after seeing that tape, they scrapped the idea. There was no sense in looking for kids who were no longer there, and less sense in risking officers who might decide to have a seat as well. I lost my best friends that night. Sometimes it feels like the chair cursed me after all. Everyone in town assumed I had something to do with their disappearance, though they never got up the courage to say it to my face. I ended up leaving town to attend college, and I've never seen any reason to go back. Kids, however, still go missing in those woods. I can't help but wonder how many of them are lost to the woodland seat. So if you find a strange chair in the forest, steer clear. It's made for only one occupant, though it will gladly accept you as long as you can bear it. It's always a good idea to be very careful where you plant your buns when you're on a hike. Remember that if you come across any strange seats out in the woods. Moving from strange seats to ominous chairs, let's hear about a bedtime ritual that attracts the attention of a strange guardian who may be less benign than we thought. Let's hear a tale about the chair at the end of the bed. Mark and I grew up together, meeting in nursery school when we were about 2. We played with the same toys, learned the same games, read the same books, and when we started school, we were both delighted to find that we were in the same class. I didn't really notice the chair at the foot of his bed until we were 6. We were playing Super Nintendo in Mark's room, being rambunctious and probably making a lot of noise. Our game of Mario Kart had turned into a little bit of horseplay, and when I bumped into the old wooden chair at the end of his bed, he jumped up like he'd been scalded. He picked it up, dusting the seat like it might be offended as he placed it carefully back where it had been. "Sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to push your chair over." "That's okay. It's just got to sit there. It's kind of important." "Why is that?" I asked as he reached for his controller to go back to playing the game as if nothing had happened. "Oh, that's where my guardian angel sits at night." He said it in that way that made it very clear this was both something he believed in and was as normal to him as the toast he'd had for breakfast. When he noticed I hadn't picked up my controller to begin playing again, he looked back at me in confusion and seemed surprised by my look of stunned interest. "You're what?" My guardian angel, he said. What, you don't have one at the end of your bed every night? I told him I didn't, and he seemed surprised. Huh, Mom said everybody had them. He tried to go back to the game again, but I found myself much more interested in this guardian angel thing than our game of Mario Kart. As kids, you get used to hearing your playmates spout out about all kinds of odd things. Sometimes they don't really make sense. This, however, had been endorsed by a grown-up. To a kid barely into his 7th year, the word of an adult was still something I put a lot of stock into. If his mom had told him this, then it had to be true. And if a real angel sat at the end of his bed every night, then I wanted to know more about it, or even see it if I could. Okay, he said, so when I was little, I woke up and found something at the foot of the bed that scared me. I thought it was a monster at first, but when I went and told my mom about it, she said it was my guardian angel. After that, we left a chair so that it could sit, since before it had just been standing at the foot of the bed. And it comes every night? Every night. And now I'm not afraid of him, since I know that he's there to watch over me. The whole thing interested me greatly. Mark's family didn't strike me as particularly religious. I don't even think he went to church. So the idea of Mark having a guardian angel and not me was a little bit weird. If it was a real thing and Mark wasn't just pulling my leg, I wanted to see it too. That was when I started bothering Mark's mother, my mother, and Mark about having me over for a sleepover. We were getting to that age where sleepovers were pretty common, but it seemed like they just never had a good time to do it. There were always weekend plans. My parents were religious, so we always went to church on Sundays. I started trying for Friday night, or Saturday maybe, but there just always seemed to be something to stop us from spending the night at his house. As if in answer, Mark came to stay at my house a couple of times. That was fun, but it ultimately wasn't what I wanted. We couldn't see Mark's guardian angel at my house, after all, so I kept asking and asking if I could stay the night, and finally we found a time that made it work. We were in 2nd grade, a whole 2 years after I started asking, when my parents suddenly needed to go out of town and didn't have a way to bring me with them. It was right in the middle of the school year, and they needed to go to a funeral from Thursday morning to Friday night. It wasn't really the sort of thing you could bring a kid to, and I suggested that maybe I could stay with Mark. My parents liked the idea. We had hosted Mark a few times, so his parents could have a date night or visit relatives, and so they called to see if it was something they could do. Mark's parents said they'd be happy to help, and I was filled with excitement as I packed my bag for a couple of days at Mark's house. Wednesday night was a blast. Mark's dad grilled hamburgers in the backyard while we played on the slip and slide. Mark's mom had rented a game from Blockbuster that we took turns playing. We watched some TV in the living room. His parents said we could stay up a little later than usual, and when his mother said it was time for us to get ready for bed, I felt excited all over again. As I lay on my pallet that night, sleeping in the shadow underneath Mark's bed, I was filled with anticipation as I watched the chair. I'd waited for years to see this, and I wasn't going to sleep until I saw it. The chair just sat there, a mute hunk of wood, and as the lights went out and Mark's last-minute chatter turned into soft snoring, I tried my best to stay awake. I wanted to see it, but as I began to yawn more frequently, I wasn't sure I'd make it. I wondered if Mark really had just been pulling my leg, and as the alarm clock on the nightstand went from 10:30 to 11, I thought it'd be a real joke if there never was an angel, and he'd just been having a laugh at me all these years. As my eyes grew heavy, I tried to keep awake until it got there. Inevitably, though, I lost the fight and fell asleep. I came awake suddenly in the unfamiliar darkness of Mark's bedroom. It was very early, and as I sat up with a start, I remember feeling that momentary sense of confusion. Where was I? What was going on? That was when I remembered that I was at a sleepover at Mark's, and why I was at a sleepover at Mark's. I glanced up at the chair, expecting to see something in white robes with wings and a halo, but I was disappointed in that respect. Disappointed, but utterly terrified. What I saw was a shapeless shadow with vaguely human proportions. The dimensions seemed to move when I watched it, though I don't think it had noticed me. It was leaning forward in the chair, staring at Mark like a hungry shark, and it didn't turn to look at me until I started screaming. It shifted its soupy face towards me, and I saw a pair of dancing red eyes amidst the miasma. It went right on looking at me until someone turned the lights on, and as the room came into view, the creature was just gone. Mark's mother was sympathetic, asking what had happened, and I lied and told her I just had a bad dream. She bought it, I think, but I think Mark knew what I had seen. He tried to ask me about it, but I rolled over and faced the wall as I pretended to go back to sleep. Mark tried again as his mom took us to school the next day, but I didn't want to talk about it. I was as terrified of what I had seen as I was disappointed at the outcome of my curiosity. My parents picked me up from school that day, having gotten back a little early, and I think they too sensed that something had happened. I slept more soundly in my own bed than I ever had before, and I never asked to sleep at Mark's house again. I may have never asked to spend the night at his house. But Mark and I remained good friends. I still went over to his house, I still hung out in his bedroom, but I never stayed after dark again. Incidentally, since the sleepover had been such a success, his mother let Mark stay over at our house more often. This seemed to work better for Mark's parents, too, and looking back, I don't think they got along well. They argued a lot, and many of the trips they took together ended abruptly without helping their marriage. When they divorced after Mark graduated high school, I think it was only really a surprise to Mark. They decided to sell the house and split the money, and Mark decided to move out on his own and start his adult life a little earlier than he had expected. So, when he asked if I wanted to be his roommate, it seemed like a no-brainer. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near the college Mark was attending, and it was pretty cool. We got on about as well as 2 high school kids moving in for the first time together could. There were arguments about chores, loud parties that probably bothered the neighbors, late-night underage drinking sessions where we told each other all sorts of things, and plenty of general day-to-day life stuff. The things we had meshed well together in our new home, except for one thing he had brought from his old house that stirred up some memories I didn't want to think about. I was helping him move his things out of the back of his dad's F-150 when I caught sight of something that I hadn't thought about in years, though it had played quite often in my nightmares. Picking up a stack of boxes revealed a familiar wooden chair that had sat at the end of Mark's bed for as long as I could remember. It was the chair that the angel had sat in and watched him sleep. I asked him why he had brought it with him, and he looked at me like I was a fool. It's where my guardian angel sits. Duh. Why wouldn't I bring it? I had kind of hoped that the angel was just an at-his-house kind of thing, and the thought that it might be in our apartment at night gave me the creeps. My boss had been asking if I'd be interested in working the night shift for months, and after seeing that chair sat with such care at the end of his bed, I went and told my boss that I was ready to accept. I wanted to live with Mark and help him out, but I just couldn't stand being in that house at night. I could tell that Mark was a little miffed that I wouldn't be at home at night. Night was kind of the only time he wasn't at school or work, but he understood that the bills had to be paid. I don't think he actually understood why I'd taken the night shift. If I was off, I always kept my door locked and slept facing the wall. If the angel ever came into my room, I never knew about it. I certainly never left a chair at the foot of my bed, and I guess if it came to our house, it stayed in Mark's room. Though I guess in the end, it worked in Mark's favor. I was at work one night, playing on my phone and watching cameras, when my phone rang. I saw that it was Mark and figured he was just making sure I was going to be home in the morning before he had to go to school. When I picked up, however, he sounded frantic. Mark was yelling about needing me home right away and how he needed help calling the police. I told him to calm down and just go ahead and call the cops, but He said he couldn't until he cleaned up a little bit. Then he said the most chilling thing I'd heard since we were kids. The angel got him. Got who? I asked, still not sure what was going on. The intruder that broke into our house. I called my boss and told him about the situation, and he agreed to come work for me so that I could get things sorted out. I offered to come back, but he said there was no need. I was probably looking at police reports and other paperwork anyway, but to let him know if I wasn't going to be in tomorrow night so that he could make arrangements. He even said he'd pay me for the night. My boss was a good guy, one of the best bosses I've ever had, and I always appreciated how helpful he was. By the time I got home, Mark was in a tizzy. With good reason, too, since it looked like someone had exploded across his floor. There was blood on the walls, blood on the carpet, blood across the bedspread of Mark's bed, as well as hair, meat, and bones everywhere. The bones were splintered and broken, and everything looked like someone had been fed into a wood chipper. I didn't know what to make of it, but the most striking was the blood splashed across the plain wooden chair that sat placidly amidst the gore. I pulled Mark into the living room and asked him to tell me exactly what had happened. After a few glasses of water and a little scotch, he finally stopped shaking enough to tell me. He said he had heard the guy come in with a key, and he thought it was me. He had rolled over and went back to sleep, already seeing the angel there and feeling safe as he usually did. When he heard rustling in the living room, he thought it was a little odd, but figured I was just settling in for some gaming. When his bedroom door opened, he knew something was amiss. I didn't usually go into his room at night, especially not after what Mark considered bedtime, and the door opening made him turn to confront whoever it was. He had sat up in bed, looking at the person silhouetted in the hall light, and that's when he saw the angel turn its head to look at the intruder. "What the hell?" the guy said, his voice deep and confused. Mark said he had taken a step into the room, fiddling with something in his pocket, but he never got out what he intended to use. Suddenly the angel was standing, and Mark said it just sort of blurred at the guy. He knew how that sounded, but it was like one minute it was standing beside the chair, and the next they had been face to face in the doorway. He had reached out towards him, his hand sinking into the man's chest, and the intruder had made a noise like he was having indigestion. The angel simply pulled him to pieces. He had ripped him right down the middle, long ways, and that had been where most of the blood had come from. He had thrown him against the wall, well, half of him, and the other half he had dragged to the floor and began to eat. Mark said that had been the worst part, watching it eat. It didn't eat like a normal creature. It ate by pressing its formless head against the body. Parts of the body just disappeared. It was like watching something that I couldn't see devour somebody. As it ate, Mark had gotten shakily out of bed and moved slowly around the perimeter of the room. He had watched the thing as he went, unsure whether it would hurt him or not, and when he came to the door, his hands trembled as he reached for the light switch. Just as the lights came on, the creature had looked up in surprise. Its eyes almost looked betrayed, and as he dissipated, Mark was left with the remains of its feast. I don't know what to do. The cops are never going to believe that some weird angel that I've had since I was a kid tore this guy apart. This is a little excessive, even for a home invader, and I'm afraid that I'm going to be in trouble. It's probably going to incriminate both of us for me to put this in here, but we came up with a story that wouldn't sound quite so crazy. The story was that Mark had been in the bathroom when the guy came in. Mark had locked the door and hunkered down to wait on them while they started taking things. While hiding, Mark heard something going on in the bedroom, and when everything had gone quiet, he came out to find the guy like that. It was a shaky story. The cops were likely to raise an eyebrow at it, but Mark isn't a very big guy, and The idea that he might have hidden instead of trying to confront a home invader isn't too far-fetched. No more far-fetched than the idea that he could rip a guy in half. So we called the cops, and after answering some questions and a trip to the station for some more questions, we were put up in a hotel for the night while they checked out our apartment. It turned out that the guy who had come in to rob us was the landlord's nephew. We've had several apartments that had been broken into without much sign of a break-in, and the cops finally had their answer. The nephew has been using the keys from the main office to go into people's houses, and he usually chooses places where no one was likely to be home. I'd met the nephew on the on-site gym a few times, and he knew I worked nights and likely thought my apartment would be empty, not realizing I had a roommate. They found a lot of evidence at the nephew's apartment, an apartment owned by his uncle, too, so the case seemed pretty open and shut. Most of them thought that he'd had an accomplice who was on drugs or something, and the two had just gotten into a brutal exchange over some of the plunder. We actually got a small reward for calling it in, though I think our landlord had mixed feelings about the whole incident. Mark threw the chair out after that. He just didn't feel safe with it at the end of his bed anymore. The angel had been his guardian, and it had protected him, though maybe a little overzealously. It's unclear whether Mark would still be alive if it hadn't been there, but it seemed that, like me, Mark had seen more than he was comfortable with when he'd seen it attack the guy. He put the chair by the dumpster, and somebody must have taken it because it was gone by the next day. I don't know if the angel still comes back to the foot of his bed or not, but if it does, I guess it's standing these days. Say what you will, but a good security system like that is often hard to find. Moving on, let's hear about a mantra and a strange priest who gets a little bit more of a look at God than he might have expected. So let's hear about the strange catechism. If I make this shot, the world will live. It's something I'd heard my whole life, though it's never been this clear. If I make this shot, the world lives. As a kid, it would rustle across my brain like a flock of birds. Sometimes if I was thinking hard about something, and sometimes when I was just being quiet and trying to focus. It was never distracting, never something that tore me away from my day-to-day life, and in fact, it made me feel safe. It wasn't even in my voice, not any voice I was familiar with. They say that when you talk to yourself, and your internal voice talks back to you, it's still your voice. This voice wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. My whole life, it sounded like the same childish trill. As I got older and started going to church, I started to think it might be something different. I noticed that the voice always came before something good, giving me the confidence to try things I wouldn't normally do. I'd hear the voice just before a test, or right before I stepped up to bat, and I'd know that everything was about to turn out great. The more it happened, the more I became convinced that I was special. The longer it went on, the more I thought I was hearing the voice of God. I told my priest about it, my family being very Catholic, and he said it sounded like I had a close relationship with God. Even at 8 years old, I could tell that he didn't believe me, but I didn't care. I knew what I was hearing, and I knew it was important. The more it pushed me towards success, the more I started saying it to myself like a mantra. I'd say, if I make this shot, the world will live, just before I went on stage for a debate. I'd say, if I make this shot, the world will live, just before I took a test. I'd say, if I make this shot, the world will live, just before I hit a ball or threw a basketball, or did anything I wanted to succeed at, and if I heard the voice say it back, then I'd know that I was about to do great things. It's what pushed me into the priesthood, and pushed me to my ultimate act of blasphemy. That's not the right word, but it's the best I can think of. It had been 30 years since I'd first heard that voice, and I was now a young priest with a church of my own. I had built a reputation with the other priests for writing sermons that kept parishioners in their seats and having a lot of luck regarding matters with the diocese. I'd gotten through the ranks faster than most, doing very well on my tests of catechism and church doctrine. At this rate, I was on my way to becoming one of the youngest bishops in my area. I had never told any of them about the voices, thinking it was similar to the way people in the Bible had heard the voice of God once upon a time. I knew it wasn't okay for me to think of myself as a prophet, but whatever the reason, I was still certain that it was the voice of God. I should have been pleased, but I found myself thinking more and more about the nature of the phrase. I'd hear it before sermons sometimes, and know that today's reflection on the Lord's words would be particularly captivating. I still said it to myself before doing anything, and I realized that it'd become kind of a lucky charm to me. Things would go well, and I would attribute it to the mantra. But why did I make this leap? Because it had always been? I needed to be sure. So I started doing research. Luckily, or unluckily, the Catholic Church has a lot of resources for those looking to research the nature of religion. There was a lot of information on prophets, others who had communicated with God and his messengers, but my own situation was unique. I heard the same phrase again and again, and if it was the voice of God, then it was the first for such repetition. God told his prophets and chosen mouthpieces what he wanted them to do. Go to Nineveh, free the Hebrews, sacrifice your son. Whatever he was asking people to do, he was always very specific. If I make this shot, the world will live was not particularly specific, though. I don't want any of you reading this to think that I went in only from a position of faith. I started by having a checkup with Dr. Redmond, my family physician. He ran a series of tests to determine if I had any underlying conditions, perhaps a tumor or some undiagnosed schizophrenia. It would have been easier if it was just something I could chalk up to external stimuli, but Dr. Redmond told me I was healthy as a horse when the results came back. EKG, EEG, X-ray, physical, CT scan, heck, you even passed the cardiac battery with flying colors. I hope the Vatican has deep pockets, because I'd imagine you just broke your healthcare budget for the year. I thanked him, figuring the church could foot the bill for my upcoming research. With the tests showing that I was in the right state of mind with a sound body, I started studying ways to instigate a more receptive state. There were several accounts of priests fasting and praying so they could speak with God, and while the idea of starving myself didn't appeal to me, it seemed to be the best way to find out more about the voice. It had never changed through the years, still sounding youngish with the first rumblings of depth, and I wanted to know if the phrase had some deeper meaning. The Lord works in mysterious ways, but if he had some job for me, I needed to disseminate what it was. I told my aides what I meant to do, giving them special instructions not to bother me, but to check on me periodically. If they found me passed out or unconscious, they had specific instructions to offer aid. If I was hurting myself, worse than depriving myself of sleep and food, I meant, they were to call the hospital and have me admitted. As long as I was still praying or meditating or not doing myself any harm, they would leave me to it. I planned to conduct my little experiment from Sunday night to Saturday night of the following week, and on the following Sunday, I would come to Mass with something to talk about for my weekly sermon. I had no idea how prophetic that statement would be. So, after Mass on Sunday night, I locked myself in my study, ate my last meal for the week, and began to read. I started at the beginning, reading of creation and of the garden, and as the hours stretched on, I began to read aloud to keep myself awake. The first night was easily the hardest. My body cried out for sleep as my stomach grumbled for lack of food. By the time Brother Joseph had come to check on me the next morning, I was past the worst of it and still reciting the book of Numbers. He left me water, asking me how I felt before leaving me to it. This was the height of my excitement for the project. I'd only been awake for about a day, and my zeal was still running high. I had heard the words 3 or 4 times throughout the night, and they had been clearer than they had ever been before. Sometimes the words were muffled, sounding like a kid's tin can phone, but that night the words were crisp and clear. I read for the rest of the day, hearing them 2 more times, and as night settled in, I felt tired, but still with hope and God's love. By day 3, some of my enthusiasm was starting to slip. I'd heard the words a few more times, twice perhaps, but I was starting to feel the effects of sleep deprivation. My stomach was also in a knot, and my head was swimming as my blood sugar fluctuated wildly. I had read stories about men fasting for weeks at a time, and I couldn't imagine another day of this. The only thing that kept me going was the knowledge that the few times I'd heard it, the voice had been clear as a bell. Thursday night found me doing laps in my study when I finally got my answer. I had finished the Bible Wednesday night and had moved on to the Contemplations of Dogma by Cardinal Mansfield. I had thought about praying, but it was tempting to sleep if I wasn't walking. I had been awake for 4 days now, and my desire to rest was almost as invasive as my desire to eat. I was dizzy as I read, the words running together, and as a stomach cramp hit me, I saw the book tumble from my hands as I doubled over. I thought I might throw up the water I had drunk a few hours ago, but instead I continued forward and fell to the floor. I landed next to the book, my world going black as I fell over, and I wasn't sure if I was going to wake up. If I make this shot, the world lives. I could hear the voice as if someone were whispering it into my ear. I opened my eyes and was suddenly aware of floating. I was hovering over the shoulder of a young giant, his face that of a high school or college student. He was writing an essay, his pencil scratching on the page as he toiled away at his work. He would stop and erase something before starting again, and as I moved closer, I could see that he had a small stack of finished papers beside him on the desk. How long he'd been writing on this essay was anyone's guess, but with an angry growl, I watched him crumble up the page before turning in his chair to face me. If I make this shot, the world lives. With a smooth and practiced arc, I watched him toss the paper into a nearby garbage pail before returning to his work, his pencil scratching away as he wrote. I was speechless. What was I seeing here? Was this God? It couldn't be. Could it? As he furrowed his brow, I saw that this essay wasn't the only thing on his desk. There was a manuscript, too, the title page proclaiming it to be Golden Fields. I began to understand why I had heard him say the mantra so many times. I assumed it was part of his process, and the throwing away of ideas was as much a part of it as writing itself. If I were to read that manuscript, I wondered, would I find a priest in it? Perhaps one who hears voices? Was this man my creator? My God? The architect of everything that I knew and loved? I came to in the emergency room, Brother Marcus having found me seizing on the floor and called an ambulance. Now I lie here, contemplating what I saw. Was it real? Did I actually see these things? Did I actually see this being, or was it something my mind created? As I sit here, I can still hear the words from time to time, but I don't say them anymore. The church has given me a short leave of absence, but I don't know if I can ever go back to my old life. How can I preach of God and glory while I know in my heart that we exist because of a single being and his ability to throw a paper ball into a hoop? It makes me realize how insubstantial we are, how little we matter. But that's not the worst thing that has occurred to me while I lay here. As I sit and listen to the listless beeps of the machine, I find my mind circling back to the same question again and again. If he should miss his next shot, what would happen? Would we ever know? If he missed his next shot, would we continue to live, or simply snuff out into non-existence? Think about that next time you go through one of your own little idiosyncrasies. You might be responsible for the continued existence of more worlds than you knew. Moving on, let's hear about another man who looks into the eyes of something, whether it's God or just a genial pretender. Who can say, really? So, prepare to plunge into The depths of faith. I'm sitting at my computer, soaking wet in the clothes I've been wearing all evening. I want to get this all down while I can still remember it perfectly. I say that like I'll ever be able to forget it. I was raised Baptist. I've lived in the Deep South for most of my life, and it was normal to be religious, even zealously so. I went to the usual activities: Bible vacation school, church camp, church 3 nights a week, sermons on Sundays, and until I went to college, I was pretty much a regular churchgoer. Once I left for college, kind of getting out of that environment, I kind of fell off, though. Suddenly, passing classes was a little more important than keeping up with my spiritual health. Suddenly, parties and dating were more important than my relationship with God. So I blinked one day and realized it had been almost 15 years since I'd been to church, and I thought I might like to experience it again. A quick Google search showed me a church in my area that wasn't too far out of town and seemed like it'd be a good fit for me. I saw from their community Facebook page that they were having an event on Saturday. Just a meet and greet for new members, bring a covered dish for the potluck, with a spiritual event to follow where new members could get baptized and join the church. I didn't have anything going on Saturday, so I thought that sounded pretty good. I made a macaroni casserole, one of the few things I actually knew how to make, and on Saturday, I sat at about 3 p.m. in my best church clothes. As I pulled up outside the church, I was worried that I might be a little underdressed in my button-up and work slacks. People were going in, men in suits, crisp white shirts, ladies in long dresses, and kids in the sort of Sunday school clothes I was used to seeing at different churches. Made me think there might be a dress code. I was new, though, and I figured that if I wasn't within that dress code, they'd let me know. So I took my dish and headed for the fellowship hall that was set off beside the church. I walked in the side door to a very familiar scene. The welcome was immediate and warm. A woman came to take my dish to the table as the pastor came to introduce himself as Pastor Marshall. I had expected a firm handshake and, to be left alone to mingle, but the pastor took me to each of the little groups there and introduced me to his congregation. I met his deacons, their families, the aldermen and their wives, the treasurer, the underpastors, and about 24 other families. I was escorted to the food table by some of the deacons and told which dishes were the best and which ones were best avoided. Miss Liz is a good woman, but there's quite a few eggshells in her dressing. And which had been made by eligible ladies of the church. Miss Conroy's daughter's about your age and makes a great pecan pie. I was spirited away to a table where I was bombarded with questions and anecdotes and given the usual church gossip. It was honestly a little like being home again. The church I'd belonged to in my childhood was very tight-knit, and as the kids ran around and the adults talked and laughed quietly, I felt a sense of homecoming wash over me. As the food was eaten and the plates were thrown away, we all moved into the worship hall for service. I sat on the front row with the 4 or 5 other new faces, and as Pastor Marshall mounted the pulpit, I couldn't help but smile. I felt a warmth in me, and I was already thinking about how I would have to change my schedule so I could come on Sundays and Wednesdays. As he laid out a sermon on acceptance and forgiveness, I began to reflect on my life here. It's hard not to when you've found somewhere you intend to stay for a while. In my mind, I would find fulfillment in the church, just like I had as a kid. I'd meet a nice girl, raise a family, grow old within the community where they would support me and my little ones. I know it sounds a little silly, but we all know the places that our mind goes during times like this. I see we have some new faces on the front bench tonight. Would any of you like to join our church and get baptized tonight? I stood up like a coal had been lit under me. I felt moved in a way that I never had to go to the altar, to renew my vows to God, and be washed clean in the baptismal font. The pastor smiled as he waved me up, and I had to stop myself from sprinting up the stairs. I was excited. I was in such a hurry to be part of this. I had no idea what I was in for. The pastor had me recite the affirmation, the renewal of my promise to God. And when he turned to indicate the space behind the pulpit, I realized they had an indoor baptismal pool. I'd never seen one of those before. We always did our baptisms in a nearby creek, but as he took my hand and led me towards it, I realized he meant to baptize me fully clothed. I fished the things out of my pocket that I didn't want to get wet, my phone, my keys, my wallet, etc., and set them on the stairs before stepping into the slightly warm water. I wouldn't normally have agreed to let my clothes get wet. I don't like being in wet clothes as a rule, but I was operating in a daze, and when he knelt to dip me, I felt my knees bending as I went down as well. I baptize you in the name of the Father, His Son, and the Holy Spirit. Good luck. I opened my mouth to ask why I would need luck, but as he dipped me back, my mouth was filled with water, and I was enveloped in the warm embrace of the pool. It didn't have the acrid smell of chlorine like I had thought it would. It was salty, actually, and that took me by surprise. I lay on my back beneath the water, waiting to be pulled back up, and when I opened my eyes, I realized that the hand was gone, and I was alone in the depths of the pool. The pool was suddenly deeper than I remembered it. The surface glimmered miles above me. The bottom was a shadowy depth beneath me, and I was floating in the depths like a diver. I started to panic, thinking I would drown, but the longer I sat beneath, the less I was worried. I was floating in the placid space, hovering in the placental moment, and I felt utterly at peace with the world and everything within it. I didn't notice that something was getting closer to me until it was almost too late. It began as a chill in the water, something that chased away the warmth of that pool. I opened an eye, looking to the far side, and saw a shadow rising from the distance. It was small at first, a black cloud that grew as it floated closer, but it grew wider as it came towards me. It was, I don't know. It was like something you see from the depths when you're still in the part of the water where the light can reach you. It was something I was afraid would take hold of me and drag me into the murk where I would be lost. Whatever it was, it filled me with a dread that I had never known before. As it continued to draw closer, I thought it might be a whale. I had thought at first that it might be a bank of darkness, but as it grew closer, I could see that the blackness was just how it looked. It seemed to exist inside its own fog of murk, and what I could see wasn't terribly pleasant. Its skin was gray, pebbly like a stony shore, and it appeared scaled or maybe ridged. Its eyes were huge, and the closer it got, the smaller I felt. It was massive, beyond the description of size or dimensions, and the closer it got, the less I wanted to be the focus of that attention. This must be what an ant felt like as it stood on a finger of a human, what an insect felt like before the frog devours it, and I could feel my whole body vibrating under the strain of its continued existence. It seemed to lean closer as it came up before me, our bodies inches from each other, and when it spoke, I could feel it in my bones. "Welcome back, my child." It reached out a massive finger, the print on the end looking like the indicators on a map. Even the end of that finger was bigger than my whole body, and it was like someone reaching out with a building to touch me. I closed my eyes, feeling it would obliterate me with that massive digit. But when it came into contact with my forehead, I was enveloped in a blinding light that burned me to a cinder. I came up gasping and thrashing from the depths, the pastor catching me as the congregation cheered. As their applause rose to envelop me, I looked down at the pool, expecting to see myself floating or standing on the edge of a lip, but the whole baptismal font was only about 2 feet deep. Standing up, I could see the water wasn't even over my knees. The pastor looked up, still bent and kneeling at the bottom of the pool, and his expression was resplendent. Did he know what would happen? Did anything happen while I was floating in that abyss? The longer I stared at him, the longer I came to believe that he had known what would happen, and his eyes seemed to be trying to calm me as he stood and embraced me as a brother. As he did, I heard him whisper into my ear to be easy. "Steady on, son, steady on. It's a little jarring at first, but it's all over now. Rejoice in the light, and be well." When I looked at him again, I could see a deeper understanding in his eyes, something I didn't know how I had missed before. When I looked out across the congregation, it was a look I saw mirrored in them as well. I was speechless, unsure of what to do, and when he led me out of the pool, it was all I could do not to break into a run. He offered me a towel, letting me stand shivering beside the pool as he asked the others if they wanted to come up. When the second man approached, seeming more hesitant than I had been, I grabbed my things and snuck out the choir entrance that led to the fellowship hall. It was empty now, the whole space covered in semi-shadow, and within that shadow, I could feel the regard of whatever had spoken to me in the depths. The next thing I knew, I was in my car and driving too fast from him. It was a miracle that I didn't get pulled over, though I briefly wondered who I had to thank for that. As I sit here now, my shaking has nothing to do with the cold. If this was the God of my father, the God I've been praying to all my life, then I think I'd rather be an atheist. Even as I sit here now, I can still imagine floating in that void as the ancient creature regards me kindly, its mind brushing against my own, and the dread threatening to overtake me again. I'd pray for oblivion, but I know what's waiting there for me now. One more story for you, and I've saved the best for last, I can assure you. A popular read on this channel, and one of my more popular tales in general. Let's hear about a man who becomes God, for a certain man who becomes addicted to his prophecies. Let's hear about how I was a captive god for nearly a decade. You'll have to bear with me while I tell you my story. So much of it is written from the hazy recollections of someone who was in captivity. Don't misunderstand. I wasn't abused in the traditional sense. I was well kept, I was well fed, and I really wanted for nothing except my freedom. It all started one day when I visited a new therapist. Dr. McAllister had been recommended by a friend of mine. He said he was very good, and he'd helped him get through a lot of issues that he had with his mother and discover some things about his sexuality. He put you under and put you in touch with your real self, and that was how he overcame a lot of your issues. It all sounded great to me. I'd been having trouble sleeping and was looking for some way to get the sleep I needed to function. My insomnia would sometimes last for days, and it was starting to affect my life. So, I made an appointment, and 2 weeks later I was lying on his couch, listening to Dr. McAllister count down from 10 as he put me in a suggestive trance. It was very sudden, like blinking, but everything changed after that trance. When I came out just as suddenly, Dr. McAllister looked strange, and I asked if something had happened. Strange may not be descriptive enough. He looked somehow enraptured, enlightened, utterly worshipful. You spoke to me about things you couldn't possibly have known. You talked to me about my childhood. You helped me get over the death of my mother. You helped me more in this hour-long session than I've ever helped anyone." I wasn't sure what he was talking about, but when he gripped my hand, his eyes shone like the lights of a zealot. I need more. Please let me put you back under, so I can discover more." I pulled away from him and took a huge step back. What the hell was he talking about? I had come here for help, but suddenly he wanted me to help him. I had to get out of here. I had to leave now. McAllister tried to stop me, but I was out the door before he could say much more than stop. I didn't sleep well that night either. It was becoming a real problem. Sometimes I would lay in bed and swear I heard whispers, but I put it off as auditory hallucinations. I hadn't slept well in the past 3 weeks, and I knew it was something that would catch up to me eventually. When I would force myself out of the house for work or to run errands, I could swear I felt someone watching me. What's more, I could swear I'd catch glimpses of someone from the corner of my eye, but they would always be gone when I turned to look at them. It never happened in my house, always when I was out and about, and the paranoia on top of the sleep deprivation was slowly eroding my sanity. So, when I heard someone open a window in my living room one night, I rolled over and just thought it was me having paranoid hallucinations. Turned out, it hadn't been a hallucination. When I heard someone open my bedroom door, I rolled over and found Dr. McAllister standing there watching me. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well either, and his eyes looked crazed as we stood staring at each other. I wasn't sure if he was real or not, but when he lunged at me, I curled into a ball and cried out for him to stop. He didn't attack me, though. He didn't hurt me at all, though now I wish he'd killed me right there. Instead, he just slipped a needle into my arm, and I watched his thumb push down the plunger as I felt a wave of warm and inviting sleep roll through me. I woke up in a finished basement, the lights turned down low, strapped to a chair as Dr. McAllister made sure my bindings were comfortable. I struggled, my limbs heavy and uncoordinated, but he held up a fresh needle and told me if I didn't calm down, he was going to put me out again. I made myself as still as I could, not sure what to expect here. This didn't seem to be a sexual thing. I was fully dressed, and the way he was tending to me almost felt worshipful. I didn't want it to come to this, but I can't live without the knowledge you possess. I know you don't believe what I'm saying, but while you were unconscious, you told me about things that may very well change my life. You spoke to me of things that opened my eyes, ideas I had never even conceived of, and the longer I went without hearing your voice again, the more I felt my newfound security crumbling. I'm sorry, I'm not usually like this, but I had to possess you, to have your knowledge, to understand your words. I can promise you that while you remain with me, you'll want for nothing. You are to me as a captured god that I wish to understand. We talked a lot that night, though I mostly yelled at him to let me go. In the end, though, he just injected me with something to knock me out, and I drifted off into a peaceful unconsciousness. And that was how I became Dr. McAllister's captive god. I will say that while I was with him, I never wanted for restful sleep. This was due in part to the fact that I spent most of my time in a near catatonic state. Dr. McAllister kept me restrained in a large underground area that I always thought of as the basement. I was seated in a large, comfortable chair, my hands secured to the arms with soft straps. There was a remote at hand, and I was allowed to watch anything I wanted on television, as long as the doctor was away. If I was hungry, all I had to do was push a button, and a short blonde woman, who I would later discover was the doctor's wife, would bring me anything I wanted. In the beginning, it really wasn't so bad. I was kept in a sluggish state from the drugs he used on me to induce the state that he wanted, but It wasn't bad. I watched TV, I ate, I existed. Given that I had worked 40-plus hours a week and lived off crappy food for most of my adult life, I felt almost like I was being pampered. I was free to relax. I could do almost anything, except leave or talk to people who were likely to wonder what had happened to me. My mom, my dad, my friends. I wondered if any of them wondered what had happened to me. It may seem odd to you that I never tried to escape, but my head was always in a cloud of some sort. The drugs left me just lucid enough to consume TV or audiobooks, but I never felt able to really settle my thoughts on anything in particular. I knew I should want to escape, but it was always a hard concept to catch hold of. Those days were the good days, back when Dr. McAllister was still operating his practice. That was when he was still pretending to have a normal life. He would come down in the evenings to talk with me, just telling me his problems and asking me to help. He would ask me about stocks or bonds, the housing market, business ideas, patents, inventions, and I would try my best to direct him in the way he wanted. I wasn't really sure what he wanted. My head was too foggy most of the time to make sense of it, but I would try my best to help him without the need to be placed in an unconscious state. We'd talk for hours about everything from the state of his marriage, the depraved childhood he had lived through, the future of psychology, and even the condition of his soul. I didn't always want to hear what he had to say, but I understood that it didn't really matter what I wanted. It didn't seem to make much of a difference anyway. We would talk for hours, but the end result was always a needle in my arm or my neck and several hours of blissful unconsciousness. I remember little from these periods of blackout, fortunately, but sometimes I would go to a dark place and just hang suspended in the murk. Things would whisper to me there, tell me things I couldn't understand. I was powerless to stop them. This happened very rarely, but it was still too often for my tastes. I don't know what I said to Dr. McAllister in those times, but there was always a drastic change when I came back to myself. It wasn't always for the better either. Once I came back to myself and felt something wet in my lap. I glanced down, which was difficult because my head was strapped to the headrest, and found that someone had thrown a head into my lap. I flinched away from it as my groggy brain finally clicked it all together, but it was little more than a shudder in my current state. The head had wispy gray hair, a pair of broken glasses hanging across the face from one ear, and a nose full of broken veins from a lifetime of drinking. I didn't recognize it, but as it soaked the pants of my pajamas, I did feel like it was familiar somehow. Dr. McAllister was sitting across from me, looking expectantly at the gift he had literally dropped in my lap, and I looked at it with confusion as I asked why he had done this. You told me to. You said if I meant to truly get over the cruelty and abuse that my father had given me, then I had to destroy the icon of my father within myself. So I did. I told him that I wanted to meet so we could discuss our past and reconcile. He was ecstatic. He hadn't seen me in 20 years, and oh, did we reconcile. I waited for him to turn around, and I bashed his head in with a hammer, choking him to death as he lay twitching on the floor. Then I took the body and disposed of it, cutting the head off so I could show you that I'd followed your instructions. You're so wise, so correct. I am your loyal disciple, always. I started screaming, mindless, gibbering noise, but he just bowed to me, and when the head hit the ground next to him, he didn't even flinch. That was my first inclination that the things I was saying in my sleep might be used in this way, in ways that I had never considered. After that, he started bringing people down to see me. At first, it was his wife, the blonde woman who'd been feeding me. She looked skeptical as she approached, content to keep her husband's secrets, but unsure of joining him in this new experiment. I knew from our talks that he was afraid she would leave him, but enjoyed the financial stability of their marriage. He stuck me with the needle as she sat a few feet away, and when I came to, she was bowing and crying and thanking me for helping her see the truth. My husband was right. You are truly a god. I was wrong to ever doubt you, or him. After that, it was friends and colleagues. They all seemed confused when he introduced them to me, calling me his god of knowledge, and some of them laughed, thinking it was a joke. They would sit and talk to me, listening to my answers and looking at McAllister as if to ask if this were an elaborate prank. In the end, though, when I came back from the little nap he would subject me to, it was always the same. Their smirks of disbelief or scowls of confusion were replaced with rapturous awe, and they would pledge their undying fealty to me. No matter how many of them I begged to release me, the outcome was always the same. A religion of sorts began to form. Over time, McAllister drew in his cult. It was only a few at first, 5, 10, but it quickly grew into a sizable little flock. The followers began to take care of me, washing and feeding and seeing to my every whim, except the most important. I would ask them to release me, beg them to let me go, but it was always interpreted as a test of some sort. Their God was testing them to see if they were loyal to the here or to the hereafter, and they would thank me for helping them fortify their belief in me as they slid my hands back into the restraints or pushed my head back into the buckles. I yelled at them. I called them idiots. I tried to push them, but the constant use of sedatives and the lack of any regular exercise had made me weak. I wasn't wasting away, but I wasn't getting the exercise I needed to be certain. I could do little to free myself. My bonds always replaced, and after a while I just gave in. The funny thing was that whatever I was telling them while I was under was working. McAllister showed me the money he had made, earned from the stock market and selling property, and the cult began to thrive. What's more, they all claimed to have cast off whatever addictions or mental health problems or childhood traumas had plagued them, and they were addicted now to nothing but serving me. Like McAllister had said, those who tried to leave or to return to their lives reported feeling hopeless and manic unless they could return to my presence and hear my words, whatever they were. That's when things started to get bad. McAllister was truly addicted to my influence, and it led him to overstep. McAllister had been gathering his followers at his home, and while it was large, it was becoming too small to hold all of them. I can't really speculate how many there were, but the basement was standing room only. I sat beneath a small bar that he was standing on, and the sea of bodies was dizzying. Though he was speaking, they all looked at me as if I were speaking through him. So many eyes looking at me. My body still held in the chair I had sat in for God knew how long, was something I never quite got used to. It never made me feel like a deity. It never made me feel powerful to have them worship me. It always made me feel like a pet, my freedom just one open door away. McAllister said they'd be moving to a new place soon, a place that would house them all comfortably. They could all stay there indefinitely, leaving their jobs and lives behind so they could care for their captive god. He didn't say where it was, but he said they would all go this afternoon and prepare for a long journey. They were all so happy, their faces enraptured as he told them about their new home. But I began to feel that this would never end. When he began to bring people to see me, I had hoped that someone would fail to see me as he did and get me out of here. They would take me away from him. They would call the police, and I would be saved from my captivity. That never happened. Whatever power I had held them in sway, and after a while I doubted that I would ever get out of here. I didn't know how long I had been McAllister's captive god, but I knew that no matter how comfortable the life, this had to end. I decided then that if they weren't going to get me out, I would have to do it myself. Strangely, my chance came that very day. They had all left me so they could prepare, and as I sat in the shadowy basement, I realized that my wrist strap was undone. This had never happened before. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to do. It took all the energy I had to focus enough to get my hand to undo the other strap. And when I bent down to undo my legs, the effort seemed to take years. My mind was like unraveling yarn, and it was hard to focus on any particular task. When the bonds came off my legs, I got shakily to my feet before bending to rub some life into them. They were prickly from the lack of use, and I took shaky steps as I made for the stairs. I got to the top before I was discovered. I peeked through the door and into the barren kitchen beyond. The cupboards were empty, the countertops clean, and I could tell that this room had already been cleaned out for the move. I had just decided to take a step out and make for the back door when someone walked into the kitchen and saw me. They called for McAllister, walking to me as they insisted I return to my chair. I pushed at them, telling them to get away from me, to get out of my way, but as I lunged for the back door, I heard others coming in to stop me. I made it to the backyard, squinting at the sun as it hit my eyes, but I found it fenced with tall wooden boards. I was grabbed by many hands, and when someone slipped a needle into my neck, I looked back to see McAllister instruct them to get me in the car. I came to some time later, and I was laying in an elaborate bed, my hands cuffed to the frame. That began the worst part of my confinement, though it was thankfully the end of it. After that, the drugging became worse. McAllister and his inner circle kept me in a near constant catatonic state. The drugs he used were no longer just injected, and they began to experiment with other substances. The documents that were found later said they received different outcomes when different kinds of drugs were used, and they often sat around and drank or laughed as I came in and out of reality. I was aware of nothing in those times. A ship drifting on a sea of time. I could have been with them for days. I could have spent decades under their control. But to me, time was only islands glimpsed from afar. I didn't see many people in that time, just the 5 or so who were in McAllister's inner circle. But these men always spoke as if they were doing very well. Often there was cigar smoke around my bed, the smell of expensive liquor, and always the low murmur of talk as they waited for me to tell them what else they might do to gain more power. I'd become their oracle, their captive god, as opposed to their revered deity, and they threatened to use me up. These are the times I remember the least about, except for the end. I spent a lot of my days in a black stupor, and the more they experimented, the more often I was back in the dark place. When I came back from these trances, I noticed a change in my captors. Gone were the shining eyes of the enraptured. Disappeared were the weeping orbs of the enlightened. They were replaced by the flinty eyes of the zealot, and I was afraid that he might break his promise. He looked angry, but also resolved. Whatever I had told him weighed heavily on him, but I wouldn't understand the burden, not for a while yet. Not until the day it all came to an end. I came to one afternoon to find an intrusive light leaking into my dark chamber. They had always kept me in this persistent dark room, but now the door was open, and something was laying in it. On the floor, there were others, none of them moving, and I was confused by their sudden stillness. Was this something new? Were they sleeping, or were they... I tried to put that thought out of my head. They couldn't be dead, I reminded myself as I shook my chains. If they were all dead, then who would free me so I didn't die here too? I did as you said, came a monotone voice, and I jumped as I realized that one of the slumped forms had only been praying. It was McAllister. He looked wild. His salt and pepper hair was sticking up at odd angles, and his face was splattered with blood. His shirt was soaked in something as it hung on him like a wet sack. He appeared to be praying, but as something clinked in his shaky hands, I saw that he held a gun. I was afraid that he would shoot me too for half a second, but as he put it under his chin, I became even more afraid that he would use it on himself. I have risen as high as I can. Your will dictates that I must shed my vehicle to rise any higher. I shall see you on the other side. His blood made a crimson line across my face as the gun went off. Suddenly, my fears were realized. I was alone. Luckily for me, someone heard the gunshot. I would lay in that bed for 2 days before the FBI came to investigate the compound. Turned out they'd been keeping an eye on McAllister for quite some time, ever since he had started gathering followers at his home. After 2 years in his new compound, they had begun to try to prepare a case against him, before he woke up one morning and decided to put an end to his little flock. With the help of his wife, they had poisoned the morning meal, and McAllister had drawn his inner circle to a meeting before breakfast. That's where he shot them, as they sat listening to my latest ramblings. They had found journals that claimed there were things I had told them, but after interviewing me, I think they decided that he was out of his mind. At least, that's what Agent Maxit led me to believe. We're going to have to hold you as a person of interest, but it honestly sounds like you were an unwilling participant. I'm going to go and get some things in order. Have a seat. We'll make some accommodations for you. After he left, I noticed the recorder sitting on the table. It wasn't running, which I had expected, and when I reached for it, I saw the tape inside had a date on it that I remembered. It was the date of my first session with Dr. McAllister. Couldn't imagine a reason behind the FBI having a tape with that date on it, unless McAllister had recorded it for some reason. I put the recorder back down, trying to stop my curiosity before it could take root. I had never heard what I sounded like in that state that seemed to enrapture the old doctor so much. What had I said to him to make him throw his whole life away in the pursuit of it? I couldn't help myself. I hit play on the recorder and listened as McAllister told me to be calm and began to count down from 10. It wasn't the jagged, often flighty voice I remembered from any time after his session. This was McAllister at his most sane, and as he came to 1, I heard him gasp and ask what I was doing. From the recording, I heard a slightly deeper version of my own voice, and it filled me with dread. Agent Maxit has been listening to the tapes. He's becoming as unstable as the good doctor. If you don't escape now, I fear that He'll have you, just like McAllister did. You'll have to be quick, and you'll have to be smart. But if you mean to be free, you need to find a way out of here. Good luck. And just like that, our stories are at an end for another day. I do hope you'll join us next week for more cozy horror with me, Dr. Plague. Until then, I'd like to wish you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.